The Baltic States, Baltic identity, and it's basically a term which has come to use only in the 20th century. It's a term that has been in flux. There are 4 Baltic states in the infamous Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in 1939, the 4th one being Finland. The Baltic states really solidified an identity only as being part of the Soviet Union. And today, of course, we can see that we are sometimes together in one boat and sometimes not. But before I come to that, since I am here to promote this book that I've written, which is mostly a historical work, I would start with some of the historical divergences that our countries have had, and then I will move up to the present. Of course, there's a lot that I can talk about in our common history, but the furthest I will go back is to the 13th century, and then I'll try to come up to the 20th century within a few minutes, if that's possible. But of course, the paths of Estonian and Latvian history on the one hand, and Lithuanian history on the other hand, diverged in the 13th century when the Lithuanians managed to resist the Germanic Crusaders, and importantly, the Lithuanians were able to do so because they were politically united under King Mindaugas, who the Estonians and Latvians were not able to do so, and thus the conquerors were able to use a divide and rule strategy. And of course, the Estonians and Latvians ended up then with a non-native ruling elite until the 20th century, the Baltic Germans. Moving on through the centuries, important milestones which separated our destinies. Of course, the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, which was successful in Estonia and Latvia, whereas the Jesuits and the Counter-Reformation were successful here, which has led to the beautiful architecture that you have in Vilnius and the university. And of course, though Estonians like to generally emphasize that Tartu University was founded by the Swedish king in 1632, and as part of the Protestant Reformation, actually, of course, the first steps in that direction were the Jesuits who came and set up their college in Tartu around the same time as they did in Vilnius, but it only became a university later. But the Reformation, of course, also had consequences. Protestant Reformation encouraged literacy, which also later meant that the Estonian and Latvian national awakening came along perhaps quicker, and it led to perhaps better economic results in the 20th century as well. But I'm not going to follow this Max Weber Protestant work ethic. But I will say that when we finally became, for the first time, Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians, a part of the same empire ruled by the same central authority, the Tsarist Empire, then of course there was a difference here as well, in that the Estonians and Latvians, for the most part, had a special autonomy within the Russian Empire. And this was, of course, not something that was particularly enjoyed by the mass of the peasantry, the Estonians or Latvians, but this was thanks to the Baltic German nobility, who had it very, very good under the Tsarist regime, and correspondingly the peasants had perhaps their most difficult times in the 18th century. But also because of this special autonomy, Estonians and Latvian peasants were emancipated from serfdom nearly half a century earlier than the rest of the Tsarist Empire, including Lithuania. And this, of course, gave a material basis for the national movement, national awakening, to happen perhaps about 2 decades earlier amongst the Estonians and Latvians than the Lithuanians. Also in the 19th century, we can see a topic which, again, is important today here, which is migration, which is taking on a massive scale presently here. And in the late 19th century, the Lithuanians went west, and the Estonians and the Latvians went east. More than 200,000 Lithuanians to the west and 200,000 Latvians to the east, a slightly smaller number of Estonians. And of course that has consequences as well. First of all, for the fate of those people themselves and their descendants who ended up later in Soviet Russia and were mostly assimilated or wiped out, whereas opposed to the Lithuanian emigres in the United States, they have had a important role later in Lithuanian affairs. Now, moving to the 20th century, I'm quite amazed that I promised that I would skip over 6 centuries and arrive to the 20th century within 5 minutes, and I've managed to accomplish that. Usually at Tartu University we have standard 2-hour lectures, and that's the tempo and pace that I'm used to, but I've tried to be a bit quicker here today. After the 3 states were established, there were all sorts of attempts at Baltic cooperation in the 1920s and 30s, which ran into difficulties. There were grand schemes immediately after the First World War of a wider Baltic bloc stretching from Helsinki to Warsaw. The first difficulty, of course, that we ran into was the question of this city, the Polish occupation of Vilnius, which meant that you couldn't have an alliance in this region where Poland and Lithuania were part of the same group, which meant that most of the other countries simply, when faced with a choice of Poland or Lithuania, decided in favor of Poland. That was the choice of Estonia, pragmatically at the time, because Poland was the great military power in Central and Eastern Europe. Nevertheless, this big potential Baltic cooperation or Baltic alliance from Helsinki to Warsaw, which an agreement was actually signed in 1922, came to naught when the Finnish parliament rejected the deal, and the Finnish foreign minister was forced to resign. And the Finns, you could say, from that moment on, basically turned their backs on the southern neighbors and started with their Scandinavian orientation. The Finns, perhaps rightly, feared at that time that they would be dragged into potential war and conflict with not so much Russia, but potentially with Germany because of their Baltic alliance. Another reason why Baltic cooperation didn't work in the 20s and 30s was because Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania had very different threat perceptions. For Estonians, clearly Soviet Russia was enemy number 1. For Latvia, it was both Soviet Russia and Germany, and particularly later Nazi Germany. And for Lithuania, Poland and the Vilnius question was a big problem. Whereas Soviet Russia, which for the rest of us was enemy number 1, was practically Lithuania's only friend, or at least the only country which would recognize Lithuania's claim to Vilnius. And Estonia and Latvia, in the post-war settlement, were status quo countries, which supported the League of Nations in every way and wanted the settlement to stick, whereas Lithuania was a revisionist power because of the situation with Vilnius, and that also put us in 2 different categories. And finally, of course, we do get the 1934 Baltic Entente, but as you know, that was made possible only by the fact that it excluded the 2 main issues that were important for Lithuania's security, Vilnius and Klaipėda. And of course, in the end, in 1939, 1940, this Entente really didn't fulfill its promise. Partly here, one can say it's the blame of the Estonians, because the Estonians were the first ones to be faced with a Soviet ultimatum. But in retrospect, the Baltic Entente has gotten a lot of negative criticism that it failed. But I think that's slightly unfair, because if we look at interwar Europe, we really don't see too many examples of successful regional security alliances. And of course, other countries which, I mean, our countries followed the example of Scandinavia and Benelux in declaring its neutrality after the alliance didn't help, and that didn't save us either. So it depends what we measure this by. And of course, there was the external factor that, okay, that Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians didn't see eye to eye always, but that situation was much more difficult than today, in the sense that there were active external actors who were doing everything possible to prevent the Baltic states from cooperating amongst themselves. Not just Soviet Russia, of course, but also Germany and Poland, who had absolutely no interest in seeing these countries cooperate amongst themselves. And of course, a typical pattern then in the 20s and 30s was anytime Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania would be making any positive moves towards cooperation with the other countries, then one of the above-mentioned countries, particularly Soviet Russia, would be willing to offer preferential trade arrangements with one of those countries, and thus demotivating that one from pursuing any closer cooperation.